And one of the things we see at some point in the next few centuries after during the Hellenistic era is we eventually start to see the Mesopotamian concept of the 12 signs of the zodiac get merged with the Egyptian concept of the 36 decans, so that eventually the decans seem to become like subdivisions or of 10-degree segments of the zodiac itself. And even though the dating is much later, that's when we start to see things like the famous Zodiac of Dendera, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's probably a good thing to take a look at now. It's probably the one of the earlier bits of evidence for the zodiac in Egypt. There's a demotic text that has a fragmentary, but it has an equation of different Egyptian months with zodiac signs, which is probably dated to the maybe second century BCE. But after that, it's really these temple zodiacs, which are some of the earliest evidence that the zodiac has really fully arrived in Egypt and is being used. And in a big
Okay.
way. I mean, it's really important. We should take a look at this.
Yeah. All right. So here's the famous Zodiac of Dendera, which is you can see in the Louvre. And just to describe it sort of for our audio listeners, it's this big stone square sort of block that was cut out of a ceiling of in a temple in Egypt. And in the circle, in the middle, you can see a circle that has the zodiac, and it has the 36 figures that represent the decans around on the outside. And then on the inside, you can see different figures that represent the different signs of the zodiac, like a scorpion, or elsewhere you see like what else? Like a Leo for a lion for Leo, or you see a crab for Cancer, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, and was on a chapel, I believe, on the roof of Dendera, a chapel devoted to the god Osiris. The main temple was devoted to the goddess Hathor. We'll talk about her in a moment, but that dates
I think
it probably to the first century BCE. Oh, that's great. That's a beautiful picture of the temple. It's one of the most spectacular and well-preserved temples of ancient Egypt. Because it was largely built in the later Ptolemaic period and into the early Roman Empire. So, first century BCE into the first century of the Common Era, broadly speaking. That's the front of it. So, a spectacular temple. If you ever get a chance to travel to Egypt, it's a glorious place. And maybe Chris, do you have I want to take a look at this that zodiac in a moment, which is really exciting. But also, do you happen to have that one with the labels on it? There's a zodiac sign for at least for the video viewers can take a look at the zodiac. There it is. Yeah, that's the one. And so what's exciting, this is a picture of the Dendera zodiac, the round one that Chris was just saying is preserved in the Louvre. And I've added some labels so you can see that there are, in addition to the zodiac signs, there are divine figures that represent the different planets. And they are closely associated. The planets are the five visible planets are all associated with the zodiac signs that are their exaltations in later tradition. And I know you've worked a lot on the exaltations, so maybe you could say more about that and what's interesting about this.
Yeah, I mean, I've always known about the Zodiac of Dendera, and I went and I saw it in the Louvre when I was in Paris in like 2007. And I actually went. It's a really funny story because I went there looking, especially for that. I was like the one thing I wanted to see when I went to the Louvre, the primary thing I should say. And I got there and I get to the section where it's supposed to be, and then I see on the wall there's like a plaque for it, but I don't see it, and there's like an empty space on the wall. So I think it's missing. So I'm actually sitting there for a few
Oh
minutes, like
no.
kind of depressed and kind of sad that I think it must be like getting cleaned or something like that. And it just doesn't happen to be there the day that I'm visiting. So I'm standing there like an idiot for a few minutes. And then I keep seeing like tourists come by and then look up and start taking pictures of the ceiling. And then eventually, luckily, I looked up and it's right there on the ceiling, like above, just as it was in the temple, right above. You look up and then you see this big square stone thing that's like kind of massive that has the signs of the zodiac right above you, and then representations of the decans in each of the planets.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and that's great to see it that way, because that's where it was originally, like you say, in the temple. And that's a really typical thing. We'll say this a number of times, that Egyptian temples were in many ways models of the cosmos. It's not obvious unless you're kind of reading all the signs, but this one is, this is the dome of the heavens really put over you as a roof, so that for people standing in the temple, it's like you're in a cosmological model, or a architectural representation of the world with the stars above you. And this is Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So, and I didn't know until a few years later, was reading Neugebauer and Parker's book, Egyptian Astronomical Texts, and they start talking about the representations of the planets on it. And they point out that the planets are, that in the diagram, based on their identifications, that Saturn, the figure for Saturn is very close to the figure, the symbol for Libra, and the figure that represents Cancer is very close in proximity to the figure that they've identified as Jupiter, that Mercury is right next to Virgo, and so on and so forth, so that when you do the full scheme, it actually ends up representing, or being a visual representation of the planets in their signs of exaltation from Hellenistic astrology, which is just really striking and really amazing, because that's a concept that's basically existed in Western astrology for over 2,000 years now. Here's a diagram with the planets and their signs of exaltation from traditional astrology. And just the fact that this happens to be in this representation is just really striking and really, really amazing, that they had created this and put this in an Egyptian temple, and that it was that important that they wanted to create something that would be so permanent and so lasting to represent it.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And there are some, I guess I should point out, that there are some scholars who've interpreted other elements of this to suggest that there was a particular date that was represented. Some people have argued that there's an eclipse represented that may have happened specifically around 51 BCE. But there's others that argue that actually this is a schematic representation, and that's why their planets are shown in their exaltations. And that, in other words, so this is interesting on many levels, just as you were saying. But one of the levels is that an astrological doctrine is basically being encoded in the heavens here in this temple. And that's one of the things that people have actually pointed out about Egyptian temples of these later periods, is that they were often ways through their inscriptions, through their decorations, they were often ways of encoding and canonizing and preserving knowledge in the architecture themselves. And so that's kind of what you have here. And also we have to bear in mind, we've mentioned a couple of times this figure Nekepso, I think, who's often regarded by many of our later Hellenistic sources as a wise king who was an author of early astrological texts that are only preserved in fragments. Depending on who you ask, these fragments at the earliest probably date to maybe the middle of or late 2nd century BCE into the 1st century BCE. And here's this temple that's just not long after that, that's already got, this important monument of an astrological idea or doctrine embedded in it.
Yeah, that's really important, that once the system of like Hellenistic astrology had been established, it became so popular and it became so widespread that in the Egyptian temples, from like, let's say the let's say, century BCE forward, that it wasn't just the Zodiac of Dendera, this one we're looking at now, but there's also other representations of either the exaltations or of the planets and their domiciles in other temples as well.
Right. Yeah. A temple, Roman period temple at Esna has the same system of exaltations. I believe a now lost temple that was north of the existing temple at Esna also had a representation of the exaltations. And then there's also various tombs that have zodiac sealings occasionally. So it's really remarkable how this starts to become incorporated into really some of the most traditional spaces of Egyptian culture and learning. That is the temple and also tomb architecture. These are not wild and crazy spaces, where you just do whatever you want. This clearly there's a sense that this lore and learning was integrated into Egyptian practices in some way.
Yeah, and especially amongst the Egyptian priests, that their previous work with astronomy for sure and timekeeping, that eventually they also developed an astrological interests and roles potentially as well. So I guess before we move off of that, so we had the Zodiac of Dendera, which we've talked about the planets being their signs of exaltation. There's also sometimes debates about whether it represents like an actual like time period in it, I think, based on signs that may represent eclipses around the 1st century BCE, or other debates about whether Neugebauer and Parker's identifications were correct and that it represents the planets in their exaltation. But the fact that there's other temple illustrations that show the planets in their exaltation or domiciles, to me, is part of the compelling thing that makes it clear that this version of Dendera does actually represent the planets in their exaltations, probably. And I think you have some pictures of some of the other ones with some identifications as well, right?
Yeah. What's interesting about Dendera, and maybe we could focus on those because we can stay in the same place, and I think they're particularly interesting, is there's a second zodiac sealing. So Dendera actually has two. And that's one of them. Maybe we could, there's a plan that shows, actually, could you show that picture that you had just a minute ago of the front of the Temple of Dendera? And then we'll start there and get a sense of, for people, of where this is actually located. There was a temple you showed of the front with the columns of the temple.
Okay, hold on a second. Here it
is. Yeah. And this is great. Perfect. Yeah. So this is this is known as they use a Greek architectural term. I'm not sure why, but it's the pronaos, or the front, front naos, the kind of a porch or portico space. It's a columned hall, sometimes called a hypostyle hall. In Egyptian, it's called a khenti, or four hall, sometimes. And this is the preliminary space that probably at sometimes ordinary people would be able to enter, like in certain festival occasions. And inside the roof of this structure, like right up inside the roof, there's another zodiac on either side of the two of the hall, like so on the far ends of it. And I think we have a picture that shows where they're located. They're on the far west and east ends of the hall, and there are zodiac bands. This that you've got on the screen here, I think, is a different part of the inscriptions on the hall. There's a good spot. This is one of the zodiac bands that are on the ends of the hall. And I think you can see in that upper register, the upper band there, that's, well, what else would that be but our friend, the centaur Sagittarius, with the bow and everything. But right. The iconography is amazing. He's got a kind of a pharaonic Atef crown, and he's got this winged feature which looks a little bit more Mesopotamian. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, so that's really striking, is that what you get is this blend of some of the iconography from some of the Mesopotamian representations of the zodiac figures, but also there's sometimes Egyptian adaptations of them where different Egyptian features either are merged with that or completely replace the Mesopotamian versions.
Right. And I think I have some other ones with the figures labeled. Oh yeah, well here this is good though. You can also see Capricorn there, I think.
Right, the goatfish.
Right, the goatfish. But there's also other, and below them, these are the decans as well. So it's similar to the round zodiac at Dendera. You have kind of an outer band with the decans, and then an inner band with the zodiac signs. And so you're seeing that in an Egyptian temple, the fusion of the zodiac taken over from Mesopotamia through these cultural contacts, and
Right.
the very long-standing Egyptian tradition. And then this goddess here that now that we're zoomed out, you can see this goddess stretching over is just a very typical representation of the goddess Nut that we've been mentioning several times, the sky goddess.
Got it. All right.
Yeah.
And then let me pull up so you also have a broader plan that you made. Here's the image.
Yeah. So this is an image so of a plan basically of the roof, and there's a central column, the aisle of the main entry, and then two bands of other processions of divinities. But on the far ends, there is there's zodiac and decan bands. And and they've split the zodiac in an interesting way. So unlike the circular one that's in the roof, it's not a round band like we're used to seeing with a series of zodiac signs, but it's been split so that half is basically Cancer, or Pisces to Cancer, and the other half is Leo to Capricorn.
Right, because we've got a rectangular temple, and then on the far sides of the temple, like one side has one half of the zodiac, and then the other side of the temple has the other half of the zodiac.
Exactly, yeah. And Christian Lights and others have argued that this way of splitting the zodiac is significant because it puts emphasis on the two solstice points, because those are the dividing points, that is the winter and the summer solstice. And in the context of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, this is particularly significant because Hathor was in many texts associated with an important myth that's connected to the New Year's cycle, the cycle of the annual cycle of the year, the New Year's festival, and the return of the inundation. So in this picture we have here, we have the two halves once again, from Pisces to Cancer and from Leo to Capricorn, and all of the different divinities. And I've labeled the different signs of the zodiac. It's also worth pointing out that there's other traditional Egyptian constellations that are interspersed in these as well. So they haven't abandoned some of these older traditions. And there's also the decans. But there's also other figures as well that are important, like planetary figures. And also, if we're back up in the upper left corner there with there we go, with Cancer, and we see the star Sothis, or Sopdu, or Sirius, the dog star that rose just before the inundation came. Its heliacal rising was just before the inundation, and it's represented right next to gods associated with the inundation, Anubis and Satet, right there. So it's very much a zodiac, but it incorporates all of these Egyptian elements as well.
Yeah, so we're seeing like a real blending of Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultural and astronomical factors basically in here. And then also, interestingly and important for our purposes, is that the planets are also represented in here as well, and they happen to be in very specific positions.
Yeah, exactly. So here we have a section of the panel so you can see better the images, and you can see Gemini there, which again is another interesting adaptation. We're used to them being the twins. In Egyptian representations, they are often Shu and Tefnut, who are brother-sister gods, and they're represented right there as a pair, extending their hands to one another. But then to the right of them is a representation of Mercury, which in the form of a human headed divinity. And it's hard to tell otherwise, except he has a star on the top of his head to show that he's a star, a planet. But in the hieroglyphs just above his head and to the right that he's facing towards, the Egyptian name of Mercury, Sebeg or Sebka, is written there, so you know who it is. And then, yeah.
So we have Mercury in proximity in this like temple illustration or relief. Mercury's in proximity to Gemini.
Exactly. Yeah. And so then likewise, here's Taurus, very easy to recognize, but given a kind of a lunar disk maybe above. And then a couple of figures over is Venus, or Panechertua, as Venus was known, which means the morning god. So they had different names based in earlier Egyptian tradition for the planets and the divinities associated with them, but they were blending that with these Mesopotamian traditions of the zodiac. So you can see obviously the other point is that these are the planets in the signs of their domiciles.
Right. So Venus is basically in Taurus in the diagram. And then it turns out that if you go through all the other planets, that all of the planets are in their domiciles according to the traditional, or at least the Hellenistic, the system that came about in the Hellenistic period and then was used from that point forward for assigning each of the 7 traditional planets to 1 or 2 of the signs of the zodiac, which I have a diagram for right here. So here's the domicile scheme with the 2 luminaries assigned to Leo and to Cancer, and then the rest of the planets assigned flanking out from there based on their relative speed and distance from the sun.
Right. Yeah.
So that's really cool that this, again, another illustration. So we have one illustrating the exaltations, and then we have another that's illustrating the domicile scheme.